What a delight it is to be back here. Yes, I just returned yesterday from the Dominican Republic. I was there to help a ministry entitled Kids Alive, having a fantastic ministry in the lives of children through schools and orphanages and encouraging them and speaking at a conference. It's great to be here. My schedule has been very busy. Perhaps you heard about the preacher who dreamed he was preaching. And then he woke up and found out he was. So maybe that'll be my experience here today. One more story. You perhaps heard in Iowa, there was a janitor in a little church, and he was speaking, this janitor was, to a parishioner about the furnace. And somebody overheard the conversation, thought that he was talking about the pastor. What the janitor said was, the blower still works, but the fire's gone out. So even though I'm getting older, and I'm a year older than I was last year, I hope that the blower works, and thank God the fire has not yet gone out. So it's great to be here. I want to commend you, Dave, and your committee for giving the church in Babylon to the members here. I believe very deeply about this book. As I was working on it, struggling with parts of it, I had a bright idea. I gave it to Jesus. I'd wake up in the morning and say, well, Jesus, what do you want to say to your church? And the result, eventually, the church in Babylon deals with issues today: transgenderism, 5 false gospels in the evangelical church, technology. I looked around and said, what are those elements today that the church is facing? We're in a different Babylon, and so I really do genuinely give God the glory for the opportunity I've had to minister in various ways. Now, I know I do this occasionally, but because my book is being given out today, I think that maybe I should do it at least one more time, Dave. I didn't receive your permission, but forgiveness is easier than permission. As all of you know, we are here in North Carolina, where a very famous evangelist died in February, a man who had a great impact on my life. Some of you have heard this before, but my generation of teenagers was into Elvis, and I was into Billy, and I think I made the better choice, actually, as a matter of fact. And so what I'd like to do is to do a line or two of how Billy Graham might give an invitation when he was much younger, and the book that he might offer to millions of listeners. So we'll see how this comes out, and you'll understand why in a moment. It'll only take a moment, but this is Billy Graham giving an invitation. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to come, hundreds of you. You simply get up out of your seats, and I want you to come. And for the many of you who have joined us tonight by television, we'd like to send you some literature. We'd like to send you a book that has been a blessing to tens of thousands of people around the world, written by Pastor Lutzer. Just write to me, Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. That's all the address you need, just Billy Graham, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now until the same time next week, goodbye, and may the Lord bless you real good. Brothers and sisters, welcome to Babylon, the church in Babylon. When I look at the Old Testament and want to see a parallel to the church, it's very difficult. Because the Old Testament was a theocracy. You have, for example, Elijah killing the prophets of Baal, the false prophets. Wouldn't you like to do that today? But we don't. They're all over television, but we live in a different era, and if it's okay to use the word, Dave, a different dispensation. So the question is, where do we find help? As I looked in the Old Testament, I think that one of the best examples is when the Jews were taken to Babylon and they found themselves as a minority in the midst of a majority pagan culture. And the lessons that they had to learn are lessons that we had to learn. Now, we must understand that it was a day, for example, of false prophets. I'm amazed how Jeremiah goes through chapter after chapter talking about false prophets. And what they were basically saying is the same thing that false prophets say today. We can have the blessing of God without repentance. By the way, you know what Jeremiah says about the false prophets of his day? They healed the wound of my people too lightly. And many people are healing the wounds of their people too lightly. So it's in the midst of this culture that they had to now minister as they were taken. About 10,000 Jews with all of the suffering. Jerusalem is devastated. About a month or two ago, I just sat down and reread the book of Lamentations, where Jeremiah is pouring out his soul. He's talking about the suffering of babies dying, starving to death. And the Jews, under discipline, find themselves in Babylon, which is where we are today. A couple of words by introduction, and then I'm going to be giving you some lessons that they had to learn that we have to learn. That's where this message is going. Thank you so much. It's my responsibility to speak. It's your responsibility to listen. And I have been praying that we shall end at the same time. One of the things that you find just in passing is this: God doesn't care that much about buildings. Wouldn't it be wonderful for us to be able to take tours to Israel, as some of us do? And by the way, I'm sure this school does, but Rebecca and I also hope to go again in March. It'll be our last time for sure. But wouldn't it be wonderful to take tours to Israel and say, here's Solomon's temple? Solomon's temple would probably be standing were it not for the Babylonians or some other armies that took it down. Wouldn't it be wonderful at least to go there and to see Herod's temple where Jesus was? And yet 6 years after it was dedicated, totally destroyed, because God says, you rejected me and not one stone will be left upon another. Go to Washington, D.C., and you discover that most of the buildings in Washington had verses of Scripture. God says, if I don't have your heart, I don't care about your buildings. And by the way, it's okay to have church buildings, but let us be very careful and make sure that the building doesn't become the ministry. That's a separate subject. But actually, God allowed Marduk to win. That is amazing. I mean, when you stop to think of it, when Nebuchadnezzar built his temple there in Babylon, you can read the prayer, and the prayer is this: O Marduk, may many kings bring their vessels and their treasures into this place in honor of you. And there's Israel taking the fact, having to live with the fact that when the Jews went to Babylon, the Babylonians took the treasures and the vessels of the temple, and they put them in the god of Marduk, and Marduk won. If you ask the question, why did I write the church in Babylon? I could answer it several different ways. One way to answer it is this: how do we live in a culture in which our light is seen as darkness? That was the burden of my heart. The other question could be, how do we live at a time when it appears to the world as if we have lost? We've lost. You know, it used to be that all of our games were home games. People would be in the stands and we'd be playing, and they'd cheer our victories, and even if they were indifferent, they wouldn't oppose us. Today, all of our games are away games, right? I mean, we play, and the stands are full of people who shout epithets at us. They call us names, and they rejoice at all of our losses. We have lost the culture war, and Marduk has won. And God says, right there, I want you to be a witness in the midst of a pagan culture. And this is still all by way of introduction. The Jews actually had a couple of options. How are you going to live now that you are in Babylon? One option is anger. That's what we see in Psalm 137. Don't look now. I have it here, or at least I had it. It says, we sat down and we wept at the waters of Babylon because our captors tormented us, and they said, now sing a song of Zion. Let's hear your songs of Zion. Zion has been destroyed. Let's hear you sing now. How shall we sing the songs of God in a strange land, they ask. And then the psalmist is just emoting anger toward the Babylonians. He ends, O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall he be who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed shall he be who takes your little one and dashes them against a rock. Wait until we're in charge. We'll teach those Babylonians a lesson or two. And that's where some Christians are in this culture. Angry about the fact that our nation isn't one that was. People have come and they're standing on our turf. And we can look very angry, and you know what? In the process, we don't make Jesus look very good. But we can be angry at what's happening. So that was a possibility. There was a second possibility, and that is just be assimilated with the culture, go with the cultural stream. The church is to be in the world as a ship is in the ocean, but when the ocean is into the ship is in trouble. And the evangelical ship is also in trouble. Water is getting into the ship. Now, pastors, when you're out there preaching, don't pretend you're talking about the culture up there, because the culture is within your church, thank you very much. And that isn't so bad, as long as you realize, if transgenders don't feel welcome in your church, well, where are they supposed to find help and meaning and understand what's happening in their lives? But I'm saying something else. It's possible for the church to accept the values of culture, go along with the cultural stream like many evangelicals are doing, accept same-sex marriage, go along with the cultural stream, and that was a possibility of the Jews in Babylon as well. But God had a different agenda for them. God said, what I want you to do is to have infiltration, maintaining your holiness, infiltration without contamination. And some of you already know this, and I'm going to hurry over it very quickly. In Jeremiah, you remember chapter 29, Jeremiah writes a letter from God to the Jews and says, build houses. You know why he said that? The false prophets were saying, oh, we're not going to be here long. God would never allow his people to suffer like this. This is going to be very short. God says, build houses, you're going to be here a while. Plant vineyards, become good citizens, have strong families, so that when your families marry, you have strong families who will pass on the faith. God says, pray for the shalom of the city and become involved in its culture, always maintaining holiness and distinctly be different from the culture, but live within it. That's my introduction. Now what I'd like to do is to give you 5 or 6 lessons that the Jews learned in Babylon that we had better learn as a church in Babylon. Are you ready for the lessons? How many of you say, yes, Pastor Lutzer, I'm ready? Well, it's like a Baptist vote. You get 20% and you tell people you won, right? All right, here we go. Number 1, there are some things in the culture, let me put it differently. We must both accept some things in the culture, but reject other things. We can accept some things in the culture, but we must reject other things. Here I'm looking at the book of Daniel, and Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, known affectionately as shake the bed, make the bed, and into bed you go. You remember, they were brought and they became advisors to Nebuchadnezzar, whose armies were so terrible and so cruel that they took Jewish babies and threw them against the rocks. And God says, I want you to serve this king. Really? They were indoctrinated in Babylonian culture for 3 years. They had to learn the language. It's in the text there. I'm assuming you've read Daniel 1. And their names were changed. Daniel, his name was God is my judge, and it was changed to Bel's Prince. And they went along with all that. Boy, we wish we knew more how they maintained their holiness in the midst of it. But God says, make this king successful. But, so we have to understand the fact that there are some things that we can accept in our culture, but there are other things that we must reject. And let's make that lesson number 2. We're going more quickly than you probably did Sunday morning. First of all, we have to both accept some things in our culture, but we also have to stand against the culture. This is lesson number 2. And we have to draw a line in the sand and say, I can do this, but I can't do that. And you and I, as pastors, have to help our people know where that line is drawn. At the Moody Church, there's a man who teaches in the public school system in Chicago. And he said to me, he was told, it is not enough for you to simply tolerate same-sex marriage in the school. Unless you celebrate it, you might lose your job. That's a line in the sand. Yes, I can teach in the public school system. I can tolerate the debauchery and some of the things that are happening. But I cannot celebrate that which God has so clearly condemned. And for me, that is a dividing line. That's the point where I can accept some of the culture, but I can't accept all of the culture. So you and I have to be able to speak to businessmen and say, where do you draw a line in the sand? Where do you draw that line so you can say, I accept some of the culture as to what is happening in my company, but there's also much that I cannot accept. I can't accept the dishonesty. I can't go along with the cultural stream. Years ago, I was in Hong Kong, and there was a man who sent me to a store because I needed a lens for my camera, because he says he's a Christian. So I talked to the store owner, and he said, I am dishonest, not to you, but for others. He said, because he said, if I was absolutely honest, I could not survive here along this street because everybody's cheating everybody else. So I sat there for 10 minutes and tried to convince him that the best thing for him to do is to say, I will not be dishonest. I will be honest, and see whether or not God blesses that. And if he has to shut down his store, he has to shut down his store, because we have to be willing to live with the consequences of that part of our culture that we refuse to accept. By the way, did you know that are we in North Carolina? Did you know that it is still legal in North Carolina, from what I've read, to say amen in a service? So I just want you to be free today. The fact is this, that we have to teach people where to draw the line. And there are conflicts of conscience. There may be disagreements. For example, in my book, I even say that it's clear to me that if I had a child who was in a same-sex marriage, I wouldn't attend the wedding. But there are others who may disagree. We have to give each other some latitude here. But at the end of the day, every Christian has to say, where is the line for me? For these guys, and I think they were guys, look at Daniel. Daniel says, I can do a lot of things, but I can't eat the king's food. We don't know exactly why. Maybe it's because the food wasn't kosher. But you'll notice it says, and I love this, Daniel, I love the King James here, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. I can help you be a better king, but in the process, I will not defile myself. I will stand here like Luther, whom I preached about last year when I was here. Hier stehe ich kann nicht anders. And if you don't know what that is, then wait until you get to heaven when we all speak German. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. Wow. We need Christians who do that. And then for the three guys, and we don't know where Daniel was when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were asked to bow before the image. He probably was on a retreat somewhere doing a study break. We don't know. But they said, there's a line in the sand. We will not bow down before this image. Have you got both lessons already? First of all, the fact that it is very essential that we recognize that there's part of the culture that we can accept, part that we can't accept, maintaining our holiness within the culture. And secondly, we must learn where that line is for us in your vocation, in your line of work, in the place where you minister. Where is that line? There's a third lesson, and that is this. They had to have, these four men, had to have absolute confidence in the sovereignty of God. The thing I love about this seminary and this group of pastors here is all of you believe that God is sovereign. It solves an awful lot of problems when you realize that you're not in charge, but God is. Look at this. Marduk wins, okay? The vessels are taken from the temple and they're brought to the temple of Marduk. Every time Shadrach, Meshach, and those guys advised the king, they had to walk past those vessels that reminded them that their God Jehovah lost. And you can imagine the taunting of Nebuchadnezzar's people. Nah, your God lost. Marduk won. Did Marduk win? Your Bibles are open, and that's still also legal here in North Carolina. And I know I'm assuming a lot here today. I'm not reading all the texts that we could read and all because I have to end at a certain time. But you'll notice it says in verse 2, I love this of Daniel chapter 1, verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. Who is it that gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar? God. Because God is sovereign even when he lets his people lose. We've lost the culture war, yes. The Lord gave the armies of Babylon the power to overcome Judah. Without God's intervention, it wouldn't have happened. God remains sovereign even when his people were humiliated and sent off to Babylon as a result of their disobedience. But anyway, you know, your texts are open. Whenever somebody preaches, you should always say, where is that in the Bible? Preferably, it's somewhere in the Bible. But you notice it says in verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And then in verse 9 it says, and the Lord gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the eunuchs. The Lord gave. The Lord is able to give favor to his people in the midst of Babylon. The God who in sovereignty allowed Nebuchadnezzar to come and to destroy the city and all, and to take these people captive with great suffering, unbelievable suffering, is the same God who gave favor to those who were following him. God remains God no matter what. So, that's a lesson to learn. That's lesson number 3 in the sovereignty of God. Let's go on to lesson number 4, and that is they had confidence in the providence of God. Confidence in the providence of God. I love that word, providence, the providence of God. The reason I love it is because I have experienced so many, I'm just, the light is shining against that clock over there. There was a pastor who was preaching far too long. Blessed is the pastor who knows when he has done that. And he actually said, isn't there a clock in the building? And somebody said, no, but pastor, there is a calendar on the wall over there. Now, Boy, do I ever have to hurry. Is it 3 o'clock already? Whew. Okay. Confidence in the sovereign God, the providence of God. You can read this on your own. I'm not going to read it. Nebuchadnezzar asks everybody to gather at the plain of Dura and said, when the music begins, everybody fall down, thank you very much, and worship the image. And there are 3 guys who don't, and they had been his advisors. So somebody tattles on them, and he brings them in personally and says, look, maybe you didn't receive the memo, you weren't reading your emails. I just want you to know that if you don't bow down, you're going to be thrown in, and I'm going to make the furnace 7 times hotter than it normally is. And that's an expression for saying as hot as possible, and you had better bow. Oh, read it for yourselves, because I think not right this minute, but this is one of the greatest expressions of faith in all the Bible. They say, "O King, we know that our God is able to deliver us, and we even believe he will. But if he doesn't, let it be known unto you, O King, we will not bow before that image." Amen. That was weak, but I'll take it. You know, the simple fact is this, that they were saying this: we don't have absolute certainty that when we get thrown into the fiery furnace that the 4th man is going to show up. This might be the end. So we know what we're praying, we know what we desire, but we also know that it might not end up this way, and we trust God's providence. Blessed is the person who said, "We know, O God, that you're able to heal this young woman from cancer. And we're believing that you will. But even if you don't, we will not swerve in our commitment and our allegiance to you. And we are going to let you, God, make the ultimate decision. Blessed are those that pray that way." And so they believed in the providence of God. And we must commit ourselves to providence, as I have experienced in my life on so many instances. Lesson number 5. Whew, is this important? The need to stand alone. If it were Billy Graham, he might say alone. But the need to stand alone. Wait a moment. Weren't there 10,000 Jews that came from Jerusalem to Babylon? Where in the world were they when the music was being played? Oh, maybe they were on the other side of the valley. I doubt it. I think most of them said, in our hearts, we retain our faith in Jehovah, and we are bowing just with our bodies. And don't blame them. If I had time, I'd tell you about martyrs. I led a tour to the sites of the Reformation in England and Scotland in June, and the sub-theme was martyrdom, and how some denied the faith, but in the end came back and died for the faith anyway. Too exciting to go into, except to say this, that here were people who were standing alone even if nobody else was standing. And I say to the youth workers, and I know that there are some of you here, what you need to do is to train those students of yours to stand alone at the university. My wife and I this fall have 2 grandsons. I know we look too young for it all, but we have 2 grandsons that have entered university. Our faith is not that we think they're going to be talked out of their faith. Our big fear is that they are going to be mocked out of their faith, shamed into silence. And what we need to do is to do more than simply talk to our young people and teach them. We need to train them in a whole new way so that they are ready. And it isn't enough simply to listen to a youth pastor for 30 minutes every week. That's not going to do it. I think that much of what we do of our teaching is trying to train swimming lessons, giving swimming lessons on dry ground. We need to be able to take those young people, teach them, have them respond back to us to make sure that they understand what it is that we're saying about issues regarding God and evolution and sexuality and all the rest, so that they can stand even alone. And of course, they have to find good churches and have others stand with them. But the cultural pressure is huge. And if you will be shamed into silence, and many of the people in our churches are shamed into silence. That's why they don't witness. It's because, you believe the Bible. Woo! What an ancient book. What an embarrassment to think that those are your views of sexuality. What an embarrassment to think that you believe the book. You must be weird. You probably even voted for Trump. Really. We must learn to stand alone. And now I'm bringing the plane down. I can already see the runway, and your seat belts are fastened as we get to the last lesson. And that is, it is not necessary for you to win in this life in order to win in the next. It's not necessary to win in this life in order to win in the next. Best example, was, I have to skip that part. But the best example actually is the 13th chapter of the book of Revelation. Revelation 13, listen, if this doesn't just almost give you the goosebumps, what does? The Bible says regarding Antichrist, when the state really does become God, all who dwell upon the face of the earth shall worship him, except the elect, except those whose names were written in the Lamb's book of life from before the foundation of the world. And then he's given authority to kill the Christians. That's what it says. That's chapter 13. Let's go to chapter 15, 2 chapters later. And I beheld, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them who had gotten the victory over the beast and over his image, and over the number of his name. And they're standing on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the song of the Lamb. Chapter 13, they are put to death. Losers, if you please. But go to chapter 15. Winners, standing in the sea of glass, having the harps of God. And we need to tell our congregations, you don't have to win in this life. You don't have to be the richest person. You don't have to climb the ladder of success. You don't have to. You are not called to success as we generally define it. You are called to faithfulness, and you don't have to win in this life in order to please, and rather please the Lord and win in the life to come. Time is short, eternity is very long. Chrysostom was a man who preached in Constantinople, and he was run out of his church and so forth, and he was exiled because he was preaching some things people didn't like. And he gives a final lesson to his congregation. This is his goodbye. So what does he say to them? If you were told, hey, I'm going to prison now because of what I'm teaching, and I get a chance to say goodbye to everybody, and they're having a party for me, maybe because they're glad I'm going. I hope that's not the case. What do you say? Let me give you 2 paragraphs, and then I'm finished. Numerous are the waves and the great tossing of the sea, but we have no fear of going down, for we stand upon the rock. Let the ocean rage as it will. It's powerless to break the rock. Let the waves roll. They cannot sink the bark of Jesus. What should we fear? Death? For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Exile? Well, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness of it. The confiscation of property? Well, we brought nothing with us into the world, and it's clear that we can take nothing away with us. I despise what the world fears. I hold its goods in derision. I do not fear poverty. I do not desire riches. I'm not afraid of death. I do not pray to live unless it's for your good. This is why I speak of what is now taking place and exhort you, be of good cheer.